Hey, welcome to Native Roots Radio Presents a COVID-19 conversation here with our friend Dr. Stately. I want to just remind everyone this is brought to you by the Minnesota Department of Health. Visit health.state.mn.us to get informed on vaccines and stay up on the most recent news on COVID-19. I just want to give a big ahoo and welcome to our host here, Dr. Stately. And how are you today, Dr. Stately?
I'm doing well today. How are you?
Pretty mellow. And we have a big show in front of us. We're going to be talking to Danielle DeLong about her kids and Barb Fabre about her how her organizations worked with children during the COVID. And it's going to be a really, really interesting story. I know you have two young ones, and they were really young when COVID hit 4 years ago. And I don't know, I'd just like to give you a little history behind me, Dr. Stately. As you probably know, I was a high school teacher in St. Paul, Minnesota. And when COVID was coming about, we had a lot of weird stuff months beforehand with these big ships with COVID and people staying on. And I mean, people forget about that. And we were on strike in St. Paul as educators, and we were told to came back for one day, and the whole state shut down. It was pretty amazing and crazy back then.
Yeah, that was a really remarkable time. I was just thinking about this earlier today as we were preparing for this conversation, and I was thinking about like how, I just I had no sort of like real understanding of the scale of the challenge or the problem before us. I remember reading the news. I'm an avid news junkie. I listen to that other radio show we don't talk about, but I listen to it every single day, practically from the time I get in the car to the time I get to work, and then sometimes all day at work. If I'm working on the computer and checking emails and sending stuff, and then I'll also drive on the way home. But I just remember hearing early on like these, the news about the outbreak in Wahoo, China, and just thinking like, oh my gosh, like the only thing I had to compare that to was like when SARS broke out, or when
Right.
avian flu broke out, and the idea of like, oh, this is going to get across the world, and those things didn't really happen on that magnitude. So there was this feeling, I think, of like, oh, we're going to be okay over here, kind of a thing. And then as the days and weeks kind of played out, I was like, oh, this is really serious, right?
Yeah.
and then just like thinking, like, as I watched, the only other thing I also had to compare it to was like the HIV epidemic, right? And the pandemic that happened as a result of that, not being on top of that, right? And the slowness and the response that the United States and other wealthy countries had in sort of kind of addressing that issue. And it became a global-wide pandemic within, a year or so, I think.
Mm-hmm.
This was very different because it was not passed through bloodborne behaviors, right? Or activity. This is like just out in the air. And so the magnitude and the scale and also the speed at which it sort of moved fairly rapidly was just quite staggering, actually. And I remember just thinking like, okay, this is a game changer. This is a game changer for the way that will do everything: healthcare, education, shopping.
Right. Toilet paper, paper towels.
Yeah. And I remember somebody calling me on one evening. I think it was about 3 or 4 weeks before the declaration of we shut down the state. Like, go and get some hand sanitizers and get out all those things. And I drove at like 11 o'clock over 10:30 or so to the Target by my house, and the shelves were empty, and I was like, and I had this moment of like, just like deadly fear, because I think, and I thought to myself, this is what it feels like to live in developing countries where maybe there's war or these kinds of things, and you go to the grocery store and there's nothing there. And I just was like, I was literally panic stricken. I was like, bro,
Yeah. It was
yeah.
crazy, Dr. Stately. I mean, these cruise ships were closing down, people were staying on
Hmm.
for months, and we
Hmm.
were watching this slow, train wreck happening all across the world. I mean,
Hmm.
uh, the president, he closed China down, but let Europe come back and forth, Europeans come back and forth
Yeah.
interstate. So it was really bizarre, these cruise ships, and, I just had no idea how severe it was because I was, like, on strike. Of course, I was watching the news I'm a news junkie too, and, uh, I was in shock.
Hmm. I think everybody was in shock. And so, I think the people that maybe weren't only the only ones that were not really in shock are like epidemiologists that work for like
Right.
World Health Organizations and CDC and you know those really nerdy bean counter types. Which actually I always thought of myself as a nerdy bean counter type person, but I think I have been a little bit away from science for a few years,
Yeah.
and so I just was like, and if I'm being honest, I didn't even really necessarily think about like my own well-being. I immediately thought about like, the people in my family who were vulnerable. I thought about my kids. My kids were
Right,
11 years old at the time. And I
right.
was just like, oh my God, how am I going to keep my children safe, right? My family safe. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
and what was amazing too, we forget everyone was in the house,
Hmm.
people and it was very cool, Native Americans were making masks, and this
Hmm.
way before the vaccine and we really knew or any kind of knowledge about any vaccine.
Yeah.
You got COVID, and again, in
Hmm.
our first COVID-19, symposium, we talked a lot about you being in the hospital and almost dying, and we have, like, some amnesia and some short-term, memory. I know I
Yeah.
do. I have to have shows like this to really kinda contemplate and look back and how it affected the
Yeah.
kids, and, it
Hmm.
was crazy,
Hmm.
Dr. Staley.
Yeah. It was a very, very, um, just bizarre time in our lives. Really, in some ways, like time and all of the things just kind of slowed down,
Mhm.
and um, and then it was like, gosh, it was almost a little bit like suspended animation, right? It's like
Right.
and then the anticipation of like what will happen, and what was so heartbreaking was like watching the impact it had on our community, but also just our nation writ large and across the globe. It's like the scale of the loss and
Mhm.
just the numbers of people dying. Like I remember what was really impactful for me was like before we had the vaccine, I got sick about a month before the vaccine was available, right? So we had
Wow.
like a good 9 months or so before we had a vaccine
Wow.
available. And I got sick on Thanksgiving weekend. My son got sick a couple weeks before that.
Mm.
And um, I remember just thinking like watching on the news, watching the numbers go up, but the infection rates and their mortality rates, having this experience of like watching people die in hospitals, not being able to talk to their loved ones or see their loved ones, having to say goodbye to their families on iPads, right,
Yeah.
or through glass.
Right.
And I was like, so the moment when I got sick and I had to go to the hospital, I was like really resistant. I think I told you this, right? It's like
Yeah.
I waited till like 10 o'clock at night to go to the hospital, and only went after my sister threatened to like come over and drag me out of the house or call an ambulance. And I just I was a little embarrassed to go by ambulance, so I drove myself.
Oh, gee. Oh my god.
Just like I'm a heavy like I'm a thick-headed, bone-headed person sometimes. But I was also like I was afraid to leave my children, right?
Yeah.
My kids were sick. Their other father was sick. I was really sick. I had to go to the hospital. He was very sick. I don't know how he didn't end up in the hospital. But
Mhm.
the idea of leaving my children by themselves was just like, I was terrified. And I thought, oh, I'll just go.
Yeah.
And maybe they'll check me and they'll give me a little bit of medicine or something like that, even though there was no medicine to be had.
Right.
and they'll send me on home and tell me like, something else is going on. And they admitted me, and then about that night later, as I was laying in the bed, and I was like, I may not see my kids again. And I just, like, I had never felt that sense of terror and that sense of dread and that sense of, and I've had a lot of close calls in my life actually where I could have,
Mm-hmm.
not been here before, but that feeling of not seeing my children, not being there for them, not watching them grow up, not doing, I think I was, I had never cried so hard in my life and prayed so hard in my life, ever, ever.
Yeah. Well, let's fast forward a little bit, Dr. Stately. And I know we in St. Paul turned into online learning and definitely shooting
Mhm.
off the hip. We were lucky that our district all the students had iPads, but there was challenges with that too. And
Mhm.
really, not only were the schools shutting down, I feel like our students were shutting down. And it was interesting. We have these students that will do good or do well no matter what. If they're standing on their head, they're just, a really good
Yeah.
students. But we have the
Really
high
resilient, and yeah.
when we have the high percentage of our students that, this was what kind of future do they have? Why bother? And I feel
Mhm.
like that's part of the attitude, but it was definitely hard for me to get through and do my comedy show with my students over Zoom.
Of course. Well, you seem to be really good at it now. Um, but I was gonna say, like, I just think I remember, like, my sons just after we got sick and things kind of normalized. They couldn't play hockey for a while. That was really meaningful for them.
Yeah.
Kind of big part of their life, right? School hockey. 'Cause hockey actually seems to be more important than school for them a lot of times. But I
Hmm.
think one of the things that was challenging was that I watched them become much more, insular. Like
Hmm.
they, and I was trying to remember the other day. I was thinking about this as we were preparing for the show and this conversation. I was trying to remember, like, what was it like for me when I was around their age, 16 years old, and I felt like the world was my oyster. I was a fairly decent student in high school. I was, sure I was going to go to college, although I didn't have actually make a plan. But I felt like anything was possible, right? At their age, and I felt I had a different sense of feeling, and I just think like for them, it must have been really hard to feel that sense of like, what's going to happen? Is my life going to be resemble anything like what it resembled before this happened, right?
Right.
And I think we're coming out of that, and I think people are still trying to figure out though, like they're trying to remember what it meant to be like the social together, do things together. I think that um, my sons have struggled with school ever since the pandemic. They were struggling a little bit, but doing okay. But they have struggled. They had struggled every single year since the pandemic started.
Right.
Um, so
Yeah.
yeah.
And it's hard. I think we were talking a little bit about the ACT test. You didn't have to take that because of COVID.
Hmm.
But again,
Hmm.
it was a double-edged sword too, and I like talking about the very beginning. But as time went on, I thought it was really cool because as natives, we became a stronger community. We were doing in what we
Yeah.
were called. I was doing Sunday night symposiums with natives all over the country, and I know you came
Hmm.
on a couple times, and just checking in to see how everyone was. But as we were checking in as adults, and now we're finding out, our Gen Zs, our young ones, they have a really different perspective of life and kind of what you were alluding to.
Hmm.
The biggest thing I had to worry about when I graduated from high school was they brought up selective service again. The draft could
Yeah.
have happened, but
Hmm.
I was drinking back then, so I awfulized it, and it's like I'm going to war and I'm going to drink and then end up in treatment. but, but but you're right, absolutely right. I can't get inside their heads, but I talked to some seniors now that were freshmen when I was doing online schools, and it was really interesting to hear their perspective too, because nobody had their camera on.
No.
It was crickets, and it's not just your son. It's you know, it's school wide. People did not have their cameras on. People were
Mhm.
depressed in bed, doing school,
Yeah, and
and
I think the other thing that was challenging during that time, I remember like early on, they did things like a lot of schools did away with grading, right? So they did
yeah,
pass fail,
yeah,
and then they did things like, well, if you just show up and you check in, you're gonna pass. Like
mhm,
not the we across, I think that that's kind of like and in some ways I think of that's kind of like a trauma response, right? Like and when you're traumatized and you're like in fear or you're like feel immobilized and you feel like you're walking through, you know like you almost feel like you're like a dead man walking kind of a thing, right? It's like you're partially here but you're so far removed from things because things feel completely different, the world feels different from you.
mhm,
And I think that what happened is like, the entire a lot of educational systems just said like, and for a very long period of time, like do the bare minimum, just show up.
mhm,
You don't even have to turn on your camera. We don't even need to know that you're necessarily even here, and you show up and do it, like, and so it embedded in our children this idea like, okay, like in order for me to succeed, all I have to do is show up. I don't have to put any effort
mhm,
forward. And now we're moving back to quote unquote normalcy, and people are having all kinds of challenges. Gen Zers are having all kinds of challenges, I think, and millennials are too, are having a hard time trying to understand, okay, like, well, how do I show up in this space again, right? They're having challenges managing life,
yeah,
and that's because for a really long period of time, I think that life took a pause, and then somehow the expectations and the rules for engagement and all these other things changed in that time frame, and we're just now trying to sort of figure all that out.
right, right, and how do we bring back our young ones? I know it's a slow process, and it's cool that we're talking about that today during our COVID special. We're going to have some experts and a parent come on, as you are. Uh, it's just, it was a bad dream. And I think me being my age, it was a dream, but for young ones, it was a big part of their life and a big percentage of how long they've been alive. And so I forget about that this was, we use the word trauma a lot, but this was traumatic. I mean, no one was driving cars. Uh, there was less pollution and all these crazy things that I think you and I would have never thought we had to deal with in our
Yeah,
lifetime.
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think I like that point of fact that you just pointed out. It's like, so when you're 11 years old and 4 of your years at that point in your life are taken up, 4 or 5 of your years, that's 1/3 of your life. Like my
Yeah,
sons have spent 1/3 of their living on the planet
yeah,
dealing with this thing,
yeah,
right? That's a big, if I had to, like, I'm 61 years old, if I had to like spend 20 years of my life living like in this, it would throw me for a loop, seriously, right?
right.
I'd probably start drinking again.
Yeah, or
Maybe,
smoke,
possibly. Um,
or at least smoking. Oh, wow.
Maybe I'd play bingo a lot. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think the thing is right, online bingo, of course, because we're in a pandemic. So I think that that isn't. I think that's a really important thing to think about, and it's also like our young ones. It's like we know that the brain is still developing. Like, all of
Mm,
the sort of like the neural pathways are developing and forming. Well into your 25, 20, for some people into their 30s, right? And
mhm,
the disruption. that happens with that process and your ability to understand your emotions, your ability to take in information and process it and make sense of it, and
Hmm.
to know um, imagine and dream and understand and wonder what life is going to look like after this thing you're going through right now. Probably
Hmm.
had to be really challenging.
Yeah.
I remember my nephew Ruben, right before the
Hmm.
pandemic hit. He had just graduated from BRAC, started his first year of Augsburg. He was an Act Six scholar. You know, just an amazing. He had this amazingly bright future ahead of him, right? And then
Hmm.
for 2 years of the middle part of his college experience, he, you know, I think in the second year the pandemic kind of formally was declared and everything shut down. And he's
Uh-huh.
in his dorm room and he can't be with anybody and he's not doing any classes in person. They're all happening online. He's far away from his family because he's in the dorm room by himself. And I just remember talking to him at times and him just saying, "God, Uncle, I didn't know that I was going to make it through that. I didn't like." He goes, "I came so close to dropping out of school." He goes, and he told me this thing about he told me like there were teachers that he had talked to, professors
Yeah.
he had confided in, and things like that. And many of the professors said to him, you know, uh, no one would blame you if you did that, right?
Wow.
Not not encouraging you to stay in and stay strong and follow through those kinds of things. He said that the only people that encouraged him to stay at Augsburg and finish and just stay focused on that and finish was Jennifer Simon, who was the Indian ed, like the counselor for Native Indigenous people there,
Right.
and me and his mother and maybe his father as well, like just a handful of people. And he had to pray really hard to get through that process. So,
Wow.
um,
Wow.
and I
Yeah.
think we forget how hard it was at that moment in time to sort of like just the effort, the emotional, psychological, and spiritual effort that it took to put one foot in front of the other because we just
Exactly.
didn't know what was on the other side.
Yeah, and I think we talk about mental health, but in general terms. But now we're talking about what we've seen and learned from our young ones, and how we're going to. I guess time's going to help, but there's other things like talking about what they're gone through because I was really focused on my own stuff, and I just assumed wrongly that, oh, they'll bounce back and they're resilient, and it's like, no, this is
Mm,
part of their, like you said, a big part of their life, a percentage of their life that they went through, and they're still at the very very least still processing it, or still at that point of beginning of processing it.
hmm Yeah, and when you're 5 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, you don't have a
Mm.
lot of skills, I think, to manage that
Right.
scale of a challenge, right? Like
Hmm.
the idea of something impacting the entire globe, that has to be frightening.
Yeah.
I mean, it was frightening for me, and I was a 50-some-year-old person at the time. And so I think part of it is like recognizing that. And I think we did see an increase in mental health issues in our communities around with young people. We saw in many tribal communities and urban communities that are native and highly indigenous populations, we saw an increase um, in uh, suicide and suicidality, so suicidal
Mm.
ideation and attempts. For some successful, um, you know, following through, and ending one's life. Um, I think that we also saw, increases in substance use, drinking, and
Mhm.
people relapsing after years of being sober. Um, uh, we saw overdoses shoot through the roof.
Right.
And And the impact of those 3 or 4 years on our young people is they lost people they loved who were their peers. They lost their parents. They lost grandparents. They
Mm-hmm.
lost their peers, just the ability to socialize with them and rely on them to have someone to support them when they're having difficult times. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like the amount of despair and isolation that they must have felt makes sense that they would not feel that they would feel that there was little to live for, right? So
Right.
this the and those of us who are older in life who've already had I mean by the time the pandemic hit, I had a full life. I had my share of fun and research and development in my younger years, and I had my I traveled the world as part of my work, and I had this amazing career. So the perception that I had about it is wildly different from that standpoint and that vantage point than probably was for a younger person or somebody who was a teenager. And understanding that is really important, right?
Yeah, it really is. Well, Dr. Stately, we're gonna have a few more guests on here. We want to take a quick break here in about a minute, and we're gonna have Barb Fabre on, and you're going to be having a conversation with them and Daniel DeLong. And I think this is a good way to start it. And you are listening to Native Roots Radio. This is our COVID special here, and I'll tell you in a second here. This is brought to you by the Minnesota Department of Health. Visit health.state.mn.us to get informed and vaccinated and stay up with the most recent COVID information. Up next, Barb Fabre, and we're going to talk. We have a lot of fun things to talk with her and a lot of great insight with her organization. Again, we'll be right back after this short break. Just stay with us here.
Bonjour, everyone. Welcome to Native Roots Radio presents a COVID-19 conversation. This morning we have a few guests for you to talk with us about surviving the pandemic, I suppose, and also like what people are sort of doing, not really post-pandemic, but something we're living with and we're going to continue to live with for a while, it seems. There's always seems to be a new variant every few months or so. But this is a conversation this morning with Barb Fabre, and Haley has her.
Yeah.
Tell us about our guest.
Yeah, Barb Fabre is the Chief Executive Officer at Indigenous Visioning. She is the CEO of Indigenous Visioning and All Nations Rise, and she's an enrolled member of the White Earth Ojibwe Nation in Northwest Minnesota, where she currently resides. She's a proud mother of 3 children and a grandmother to 5. Barb has been a lifelong child advocate and has the honor of working with many amazing people over the years that has guided her to be the person she is today.
Welcome, Barb. Thank you for joining us today.
Okay.
Bonjour.
Bonjour. Happy to be here.
Tiny P.
Hi, Nippy.
Yeah. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate your time. Looking forward to talking with you this morning about your experiences over the last few years. Not just specifically your COVID experiences, but like more importantly, it sounds like you do a lot of work with families and with young children, maybe around child development and a few things. And one of the things I think that's really predominant conversation, we know, it's kind of hear about it a lot and across all kinds of forms of media. We know that the pandemic took a big hit in our communities and Indigenous communities specifically. I think we also can acknowledge that it had a big hit and an impact on our kids, our young people. For example, mental health conditions among young people skyrocketed. Suicide in many communities also skyrocketed. Families were struggling to take care of their families, to take care of their children. They were struggling to get their kids to school and support them during that time, and also just trying to keep their families safe and healthy. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And now that we seem to be out of the emergency part of it, I think there's a whole lot of adjustment that our families are going through. So that's going to be the theme of our conversation, I think, today.
Okay.
So tell me a little bit about your work and what you do now, and then also let's so that people know a little bit about what you do. And then we'll go back and talk about the more recent past. How about that?
Sure. So I've been an early childhood advocate and professional for, half my life. I'm not going to say how many years that is, but
Well, at least 12, it looks like.
At least. And so I've worked in tribal communities, worked with tribes around their federal child care funding and been on a lot of statewide and federal and national committees, all to advocate for Indigenous children and families. And I started Indigenous Visioning and All Nations Rise in the last few years, and where I'm continuing to work with children and families. What we want to do is replace adverse childhood experiences with positive childhood experiences, and pretty much that's our goal in my work all my life.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. That sounds really lovely. What an amazing vision. So I love the name of your organization. I love the work you're doing. I'm a child psychologist, by the way. So I built my early career focusing on the well-being of children. And then became a father and really had to focus on
your mental health too.
Yeah. And I became a lot more interested in parental mental health. But in all seriousness, so it sounds like amazing work you're doing. So Chimigwich for that. I think it's really quite amazing. It's really an important thing. I'm not sure you know, in my professional role, I'm the president and executive officer of Native American Community Clinic, and we're trying to we're in the process right now of trying to reimagine and re-envision what Indigenous health looks like, right? And with a really strong focus on the idea that health is not the absence of disease; it's the presence of well-being and the functionality of resilience, and re-embracing and reigniting and bringing out that Indigenous resilience and brilliance that we've had since the beginning of time, right? So I think with purpose we can inoculate those little ones so that they become strong, resilient adults, and they can change the course of our communities for
absolutely
and the future generations. So I really applaud the work you do. Thank you so much for that.
Ditto.
And I think one question I would have is in your work and in your community, you're also a grandmother and a parent. So you have lived experience in that. So I'm curious about what experiences you had in your family in your community around the impact that COVID had on the wee ones, right?
Mhm.
Our most
Mhm.
precious, most precious relatives.
Mhm. Well, so during COVID, our children really suffered. I mean, it was hard for everybody, the parents, the community. Our children, they need to socialize. They're social beings. And when you took that, COVID took that away from them, they revisited their blood memories, probably revisited the ancestors of isolation and extreme poverty because parents and caregivers were struggling financially. There was, and then children their whole schedule was turned upside down. They, sleep time was interrupted. Their education was interrupted. Their family security was interrupted. They had impaired sleeping schedules. There was weight gain, more screen time. I mean, it really, caused havoc on our families. And it's we're just slowly coming out of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really good overview and encapsulation of our experiences over the last 4 or 5 years, I suppose. I think one of the things that I remember reading not too long ago an article from, I forget specifically what newspaper or journal, but at the moment, but the across the United States, the mortality rate for the entire nation went significantly down. Where like used to be like one of the more one of the nations that had the highest mortality rate. It's like gotten significantly worse for the entire nation.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, as Indigenous people, an Indigenous community, Native people, of course, lack of investment in our communities. We were harder hit, right? And
Mhm.
we lost so many people during the pandemic. We had the highest number of deaths per capita than any other community of people. And our mortality rates are significantly lower than they used to be. So
Mhm.
and it will take us a decade or two to claw our way out of that, I think.
Mm.
But so, can you tell me any like personal stories about your own experience? Like, what was it like for you to try to do the work that you do, also to be a mom and a grandma, and
Yeah.
what were
Well, I
issues, I guess.
yeah, we had a new grandson born during that time, and so his mother was able to stay home with him for that year, 2 years, but he didn't have any socialization. He was afraid of strangers. Everybody was a stranger to him because he was just used to his parents and maybe grandma and grandpa, sometimes cousins. But yeah, it was really different to see how he perceived the world and people because he wasn't not familiar with anything. All he knew was the four, pretty much some four walls at his house. So it took him a long time to come out of his shell. He's 3 now and he's doing better. He's going to childcare. So, and I think that was the other thing that we noticed is that, the childcare field really took a hit.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was just reading something yesterday where childcare providers the numbers are going down. Everybody's going out of the business.
Yeah.
And when they don't have good quality childcare in your community, it affects the whole community. And so that's what I did when we didn't shut down. Our organization didn't shut down. We continued to advocate for children and families and childcare providers. And we seen how important childcare was to communities. They could not shut down because, police officers, the health field, they were parents too. So they needed childcare. And I know I reached out to my tribal council at the time and said, encouraged them to really start up their childcare program again for that socialization, for that just to help the need and help the community get back together. And they did. And so that was really frightening, I think, for a good year there when it first happened. Everything was shut down. And so, and children, they see and they hear, as you know, and they feel. So when the community was afraid, the children felt that. And so it was really hard mental health on not only the parents, but the children, trying to have a positive mental health when we didn't know what was going to happen.
Yeah, that's a really great way of characterizing that and explaining it. I think about like my own sons. My sons were, I think they were probably about 11 or 12 when the pandemic hit, and they just had started middle school. They had 1 year of middle school in. They had to finish all of 7th grade. On their tablets. They did most of 8th grade, about half of 8th grade or more on their tablets, and then transitioned to high school. And when they went into high school in their freshman year, it was as though they were sort of kind of learning a whole new set of skills all over. It's like how to talk to people, how to relate to people, how to negotiate conflicts, and all those other things. It's kind of like, it made me think about like how, I think one of the comparisons I made in my head as we were talking, and I was reimagining again what it was like for my kids. It's a lot like I would imagine like how some of our relatives who went off to boarding school, and of course I was a boarding school child as well. Like you spend half of your life or more of your life away from your family and away from your community, and then you come back and you sort of have to kind of try to reintegrate again. And I think about how hard it was for my sons and for other family members, people I knew who had spent a year and a half of not socializing, not going to powwows, not going to events, and how hard it was for them at that age to be able to figure out like how to do that, like how to be among relatives again, and how to do the things that we've done since the beginning of time. So tell me about what role do you think language and culture and our practices are play in sort of helping our children and our families sort of kind of recover those skills and that knowledge and that wisdom?
Yeah, we do a lot of things, to help support the culture in the classroom, whether it's childcare or early childhood program, and in the home. I think, that is something that we all struggle to try to do. In those 2 years of COVID, it should have been a prime time for us to, really practice and learn more about our culture and our traditions. But then we had the education piece that was just as important. And like you said, your sons, we lost a lot of educational opportunities for our children. And so that set them back. And it was more screen time. I know we were trying to help homeschool our older grandchildren, and they just checked out. It was horrible experience for us because, we're grandparents. We're supposed to be the fun people, and nurturing people. And here we were trying to be teachers, and it was stressful for all of us. They just checked out, and we were like the guards, and it was just a whole different dynamics. And it was really bad on all of us. Trying to, replace some of that education they lost, get them interested in education. I mean, seriously, they just checked out. They didn't think they had to do this. So, we're already behind on a lot of the numbers and education, and this has really hurt us. So we need to do everything we can. We need to incorporate education, even during the summer and breaks now, to help catch up. Perfect opportunity to learn our language. And, those things are going to help the educational piece. especially if we can make it relevant. We do the Indigibox, and I've been on here before talking about that, and that's bringing culture into the classroom so children can feel proud and learn from things familiar, and we turn that into math and science whenever we can. So yeah, just trying a little bit of merging the two, the education and the culture has been what we're trying to do too, and it's a struggle.
Yeah.
Barb, can you explain a little bit more about the Indigenous Box for people that are just listening in? I think it's a really, really cool aspect of your program.
Yeah.
Sure. So we created a box that we have. We sell to providers, childcare providers, early childhood professionals, and elementary. We take cultural, authentic cultural teachings and legends and turn them into math and science activities. We include 4 activities based on whatever season it is. And then we provide a book. We have a cultural item in there so children can feel and touch and see those cultural items. And then that becomes a teacher's gift. And so, just reconnecting children that are not Native are learning authentic, genuine, culture. And so it celebrates diversity, and children absolutely love it. I heard from one non-Native teacher that this has been her best resource ever, and children are retaining it because they're understanding it through touch and feel and sometimes taste.
I think something like that, Dr. Stately and Barb and Haley, would be great for older people too. I really was thinking about that. I need one of those.
I know. I was just thinking, she was describing it. I was like, I want an Indigibox.
Hey, Barb, how many Indigiboxes do you guys put out per year? So you do different ones, right?
Yes, we put out. Yes, we put out 4, and it's based on this 4 seasons. So the whole box is themed around that, and it's we make it fun, and usually, and it's authentic, and that's what I'm hearing from teachers, and whether they're Native or not Native, is that they always wanted to bring it in. Culture into the classroom, but they never really knew how. They wanted to be respectful and make sure it's authentic, not buying things from China, for example, and putting in the box. So it's all from Indian country.
Yeah. So the dream catchers in those boxes are made by real Indigenous people.
Absolutely.
Good to hear. Okay.
Yes.
I was going to say, one thing I was thinking was the legislature this year, they passed that bill requiring Indigenous education for all. So they're really working hard over the next several years to sort of bringing all those things into the classroom and within early child development. So probably within do you have boxes for age groups all the way up to, or are you focusing more on K through 5?
No, it's birth to age 8, about
nice.
grade 3. Nice. Right. And so, we make it very relevant. And again, we incorporate lesson plans in there. We do the developmental outcomes and connect it. We use different, teaching strategies. We're adapting it to the state's early learning standards and high scope in 2024. So those are things that teachers have to do, and we do it for them because we know teachers just do not have time. And when I say teachers, I'm also talking about childcare teachers because that's what they are.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like basic educators of any age. That's awesome. How does one go about getting an Indigibox?
Indigibox. Just go to our website, www.indigenousvisioning.com, and click on the Indigibox.
Awesome. Interesting.
I see a connection going on here with you and Dr. Stately about
I see.
Doing a couple other projects
Yeah.
with Indigibox.
Yeah, my wheels are already spinning.
Yeah, I see that. The smoke's coming out of his headphones.
Oh, I love
I
that.
have the next 10 years planned already.
Awesome.
That's awesome. Well, I want to get my hands on an Digibox just so I can feel that. Like I want to touch and feel and read. And
Mhm.
I'm thinking also like, while you were describing that, I was thinking like I'm the father of twins, and I was living in Seattle when my sons were born, right? And like really far away from my family and away from like, I was connected to an Indigenous community there and folks, but I didn't have a direct connection to people from my own community and my family. And I was thinking, gosh, I could have really used one of those boxes when,
Yeah.
as a parent, even just like, one at home that gave me, some idea of like how to do some of these things in my own home.
Well, as an adoptee too, I think about you guys working together on an Indigenous box for people that are coming back to their culture or want to learn their culture. I mean, there's a lot of little spider legs that could come from you two guys working together.
All right, that sounds good to me.
Yeah. So you also are. So tell us about All Nations Rise. What is that project or that program? Is that part of a separate initiative, or are they connected? Tell us more about that.
That's our nonprofit portion of our what we do, and that we work with foundations to partner on doing a lot of great initiatives, such as the Indigenous Parent Leadership Initiative. We also do the First Children's First Nations Childcare Collaboration. So a lot of funders approached us after learning what we're doing, and the best way to work with them is to have a nonprofit. So we did that, and having some wonderful things come out of that.
That sounds awesome. Congratulations on that. That's
Thank you.
really important work. One thing I was thinking was, of course, I love the name of your nonprofit, All Nations Rise. I mean, that's, I think, what we're really wanting to do as we think about like having come out of 4 years of the impact of the pandemic. And we were talking earlier, and I was just thinking, like, as a parent, I had teenagers who became young men during the pandemic, and oh my God, there was a moment where I felt like I'm not like my capacity to be a loving, caring, compassionate parent was really challenged during that time, because I was so, first of all, we were locked in the same house. I never got away from them, right? They never got away from me, right? And then there was that issue, and then it's like, of course, I want them to succeed in education. I want them to do well in life. I want to prepare them well to sort of become young men, and I'm trying to like guide them in that, and and all they want to be is on their game system or on their phone or their and they want to watch, I'm like, my mantra over the last couple of years is like, YouTube videos are not educational, in nature. Be like, my sons would always tell me things like, well, so-and-so tells me, and I was like, please don't listen to those YouTubers. They don't like, they're just at home creating content because they don't know what else to do either. So. So like it was a challenge, right? It was so hard to raise and mentor and support and direct your children. And I felt like there were moments where, as a parent, I felt so defeated. I just felt like I would go to bed at night, and I would just lay in bed at times, and sometimes I would cry because I was like, I prayed for these kids. I prayed for these children. I wanted to be a dad since I was a little tiny guy, and at 40 some years old, I didn't have children yet and not a family yet. And I was like thinking, well, that's it. Like, I guess that's not going to be my story. And I actually prayed, and they came in 6 months later, they arrived.
Whoa.
And so I think one of the things that was challenging for me was, as a parent, was like, how do I support these guys to become their best selves and the thing that Creator intended them to be? Like, how do I just create the pathway for that? And can you give parents advice or direction a little bit on like how to manage as you're emerging from the pandemic, and we're going out into the world now, and parents, I think, are struggling as well. Like, how do I learn to have a different relationship with my children after that thing that just happened?
Yeah, it's been hard for parents. Like I said, parents and grandparents who had to help try to, be the teacher at the same time.
Yeah. Well, many of our
And
kids are being parented by their grandparents.
Mhm.
We
yes,
lost so many people over the last few years who were parents in that 30 to 40 some year old range, right?
Mhm.
right. And you think about the kids that may not be in the best environment, and so school, or childcare was their, saving graces, if you will, to be out of that environment. Not all, but some. And so those children are really, felt the effect. And then as parents, we were concerned about catching COVID. So then our mental health and our children, and, again, our kids feel everything we're feeling. And so, as parents, I think because of COVID and caretakers, we need to really step up, when there is not school, weekends, holidays, summer, we need to help catch up. So anything we can do in those times to help them further along and be ready, uh, is imperative. We need to do that because we lost those 2 years. And I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Todd Risley's Meaningful Differences,
Yeah.
where it talked about his research showed that children from middle to high income families are arriving at kindergarten with 30 to 40,000 words, where our kids of color, low income families, they're arriving with 3 to 4,000 words vocabulary. And that was before the COVID,
Wow.
So we got a lot to catch up. And then now you add COVID, and, some children are farther and farther behind. So we got to support parents, so that they, sending things home with them, free things home with them to help kids, turn the TV off and do things that's going to help them retain over time, over the summer breaks, especially. And, school districts didn't have it figured out either. They were building it as they went along.
Mhm.
And so, I think, if anybody should be helping us try to help our kids, it should be, school districts need to be supported as well, so they can provide the best service to us and our kids. And, it's a team effort. It really is. We need to help our kids be ready for school, or be ready for middle school or high school.
Yeah, that's a really great way to wrap that up. I was going to say, it is clear that our job now as parents and grandparents, and even if we don't have children, if we are aunts and uncles, it is our job now to really stand up to those children. They are the future of our nations, and so we have to kind of all hands on deck. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Oh, Chi Miigwech.
Barb, Big Peeny Gigi, thank you so much for stopping in and really explaining and talking your knowledge. Hey, up next, we have a good friend of ours, educator and parent, Danielle DeLong, coming on.
Giga Wobman.
We're going to take a quick break here.
Through song we pray, through dance we think of our loved ones.
Welcome back to Native Roots Radio, COVID Conversation. We're here with Danielle DeLong, a Ho-Chunk tribal member, a mother, grandmother yet or no?
No.
Oh.
I just spoke the words. You know what that means.
Oh no. That Elder Jenks. Oh
We'll
wow.
have another relative.
Right. Robert's a strong name for a boy.
But Anthony has a lot of that dignity and humility.
Yeah. And you can see Dr. Stately's proud of his humility.
I am. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us today. You want to introduce yourself, Danielle?
Sure. Good morning. Honey Chata High P. My name is Danielle DeLong. And like Anthony said, I am a Ho-Chunk tribal member, a mom, a former educator and youth worker, and happy to be here today.
Nice. I have a question for you. Can you really ever be a former educator?
No. And that's the thing is I'm still a student. I'm also a student. So I'm definitely a lifelong learner and always willing to teach. And I love that statement that says there's no such thing as a dumb question. So
Yeah.
Thank you.
I live by that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's your survival.
Yeah.
Really quickly, so like you said, you're a student. What are you doing right now as a student?
So I am attending the University of Minnesota Duluth's Tribal Administration and Governance Master's Program.
Oh, wonderful.
Go Bulldogs.
Yes.
Yay.
Yes. Well, go you. That's
Well,
really awesome.
Dr. Stanley's looking for a boss, so that sounds like a good degree to get.
I am.
No, all right.
I have 11 bosses. I have 11 member board.
Oh,
that's
But
right.
you
How
could
do I
be a
get
board
on that?
member at some point in time. You are barred from being a board member.
Oh, shoot.
Just kidding. Yeah, maybe I'll wait until you get your degree and I'll tap, tap, tap. Anyway, good to see you and thank you for joining us today. I'm being really very, very friendly with her. You know, Danielle and I have been knowing each other for years. So, and I know your sister, Amy. How is she?
She's doing great. She's still practicing and working within our tribal community as a physician. So I constantly meet people that are saying, "Oh, are you Amy's sister?" And she's my doctor and she delivered, so
Yeah.
I have that connection of always being Amy's sister.
Oh.
That's amazing. I don't think my brothers have that experience at all.
No, they don't. No, they
No,
don't.
they don't.
I've
No.
tested it a few times.
Yeah.
Do you know who Dr. Stately
Yeah.
is?
Exactly. But conversely, I have oh, you're Charlie's brother. Oh,
Yeah.
It's like, oh, good Lord, okay. All right, we know who has what role in this community here.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you again for joining us. So tell us a little bit about what life has been like for you as a mother, as a former educator, as a student going back to school, and just being all those roles. How has it been emerging from the pandemic, and kind of going back out into the world and trying to navigate that space for yourself and your children, your family, and even your community, I suppose?
I would say when the pandemic first hit, my kids and I were actually in Florida visiting my parents. And then I got a phone call from my employer at the time who said, we've put new rules out due to this, in oncoming pandemic, and said, if you're traveling abroad, you can't work. You have to work virtually. So then my kids and we traveled back home and they had no school. I was working virtually for, I think, 2 weeks, and then my job was eliminated.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
So I worked for the nation, and much of our, enterprises are run and funded by gaming proceeds. So when schools and businesses and the government basically shut down, our tribe did the same and got rid of anything that was not deemed essential. So youth services, unfortunately, was not deemed essential. So my kids and I had to deal with me losing my job, them no longer being able to attend school. And then within 2 weeks, the schools had a plan to go virtual. And that was one of the hardest things for me to watch. One, as a teacher, to think that these teachers now have to develop a relationship virtually with kids. And if you've ever been in the classroom, you really need that face-to-face contact to really get to know students. body language is so much of whether or not they're conceptualizing a lesson. So when I would, have my kids who were middle school and high school age at the time, I have 3 kids. So I think when the pandemic first hit, my daughter was a junior in high school. My sons were 7th and 9th graders.
Mhm.
So just seeing them attend school virtually and not being able to like socialize with their friends in the hallways or in the lunchroom, and then having the option to have camera off. I was like, what are you doing? Turn your camera on.
Yeah.
They would, and, it was, hard for them to maintain a respect for school for that matter, because you could lay in your bed, turn the camera off, and eat while you're, listening or not listening, so, and then on top of that, my kids played sports, and that was a huge part of their life. My boys played basketball, football, traditional lacrosse, and my youngest even added baseball into the season. So when the pandemic hit and each season came around, I think football season, baseball season was just canceled entirely. And then the following fall, football was like on again, off again, depending on whether or not teams had COVID or if they had enough players to even make the game. And then further on into the year, when basketball hit, that was hard for me because I'm one of those loud sideline moms.
That doesn't shock me at all, actually.
Well, and only one parent was allowed to attend the games,
Wow.
and you had to come in masked, and so just being one, I had to be like to his father, to their dad, being like, are you gonna go or can I go? Can I be the loud sideline mom? And then it was terrible because it was all televised virtually, and I would be watching their games like on my TV at home, just yelling in my living room.
Wow.
But I think that was hard for my kids because they ended up not playing organized sports after that. They still do traditional lacrosse once in a while, but as far as like having that teamwork and that camaraderie, it just fizzled out with the pandemic. And I think part of it is because of the increased screen time. They were constant, like their social life depended on their phone, on whether or not they could have social media contact with their friends. They would walk around my house FaceTiming friends. And so it was, I think, just the decreased physical activity and the increased screen time, was something I definitely noticed. And they, it's hard to get them out of that habit when socializing can be done on your phone. And I think, well, even today when I say, are we picking up your friend to, go out to dinner or not? And they'll say, let me text them. I'm like, just call them.
Yeah.
They don't even do that. They just, it's just, I don't know.
Yeah, it is a whole new, different sort of kind of experience. I think being a parent of teenagers now who just, they don't want to, they want to do everything through their phone, or my sons want to, get online with all their friends on whatever gaming platform they're on. And then, they're up until all hours of the night talking to each other, primarily through that methodology, right? My sons, even in the same house, they don't want to talk. They don't come together necessarily. They're just starting to do that. They used to call each other from their rooms as they're on their game. I was like, you're in the same home. You can talk to each other in person, and that's probably the best way to do so.
Well, we used to do the, soup cans and string too.
Yeah, that was actually my first telephone.
That's right, mine too. I'd like to fire that up again.
Yeah, you should bring that back. That would be great.
Put it, just throw it down the laundry chute, and it picks up the other end.
Yes. Oh, yeah. So tell me, how has it been? Do you go to graduate school virtually? Or are you attending most of your classes now virtually?
Yes, my entire program is virtual just because of the pandemic. Everyone, back in the day when the MTAG program had begun, it was in person.
Yeah.
you know, and then when the pandemic hit, it just became virtual, but it ended up being a positive opportunity for the university, because now we have tribal members taking this MTAG program from all over the nation.
Yeah.
Like Montana and Wyoming. So
Yeah.
it's expanded this opportunity,
Yep.
and it's great because, you know, we have exposure to Ojibwe, Dakota, Lakota, Ho-Chunk people, you know, in the Midwest, but to hear tribal issues that are happening in California and Montana or Wyoming or, you know, even out east on the East Coast, it just widens the learning opportunity. So I'm grateful that, you know, it is virtual, because I don't know how often, if I would have even been able to do the program if I had to be traveling to Duluth 5 times a semester.
Yeah.
You know, that would be hard for me, and I think virtual would be hard for me, and it was when I was teaching, because I'm such a visual learner, and that's kind of how I teach too, especially with what I was teaching, film and video, not as much book learning as opposed to hands-on kind of thing. And so I commend you, and I imagine Haley and Dr. Stately too can read a book and comprehend and go on, but I need a little more help. And so I commend you, but there's people falling through the cracks too, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think we have all kinds of data that says, like, you know, our kids are not, graduation rates are kind of tanking. They've been poor for, you know, decades.
Mhm.
You know, I'm not boned up on the data right now, but I think, you know, within the last couple of years, Minnesota and Wisconsin kind of go back and forth in being 49th and 50th on like certain outcomes for Indigenous students. But I think, you know, we're either 49th or 50th, depending on who is working harder at not educating people well. Wisconsin and Minnesota.
Well,
we
you know,
laugh, but
and when Robert said, you know, students falling through the crack, you know, and
Yeah.
you mentioned, you know, that we've worked hard at failing our students. You know, that's the achievement gap for American Indian students has always been a
Always
challenge.
before. Yeah.
And now so many school districts are using COVID as the reason why our children haven't caught up yet. They're saying, oh, the scores are so low because of COVID, and these families didn't have access to internet or Wi-Fi, or, you know, they just didn't come in. And so they lost that connection. They fell through the crack, and districts are saying it's okay. You know, it's totally not, you know, so
Yeah, totally not.
if there's a big push for equity in our schools, and if that's truly the case, then you would see more efforts being directed specifically at American Indian students and families to get that achievement gap diminished, or at least, you know, working towards progress. Instead, it just continues to grow.
Yeah.
Wow,
Absolutely.
that's a really good point, Danielle. One of the things, I was in the parent committee back in the day, and we had up to 56% of Native students graduating on time. And for me, being educated and an educator, that was if it was with our that was the rate with our white allies and friends. We'd be red alert and it'd be on the news every day, but yet we were kind of applauding that it was over 50%, and that kind of really upset a lot of educated Native Americans and BIPOC people. That kind of what you're saying there is that, you know, we are expected, there's lower expectations, and that should not be.
Right.
Yeah. I think that it's also related a little bit to the things like, for instance, you know, we know that like there's this, my sons say this to me all the time. And of course, as a Indigenous man who has a PhD, right? Like that took effort and work, dedication. You know, I tell them all the time, like, oh, there wasn't a lot that I loved about having to go to school, but I wanted, you know, there were things that I loved, and there was a whole lot of work. Right. And so part of it was like, I help them I understand their ideas and their thoughts, but then they listen to this dominant narrative sometimes about like, well, we need people to not get their college degree. We need people to become, get technology certificates and, run lines and learn how to do solar panel. And I agree, all that is really important. But I think sometimes the subtext of that conversation is like, it's okay for people not to be doing well in education. It's okay for them to not be achieving. Because there's going to be manufacturing jobs for them, right? It's like we're living in the contemporary times of, colonial times 150 years ago when, Black and brown and Asian people built, the railroads, those kinds of things. What we really need you to do is not achieve and just do manual labor, because we need somebody to do that work.
Interesting. Very interesting. But you do need these.
I think that's what we don't talk about.
Yeah, that's very interesting. But you do need those skills in school in order to figure out how to build a pyramid of bricks
This is
and
true.
things.
This is true.
I don't think carpenter.
I don't think I would want to ride on any railroad that my children built. I mean, I do love them. They're amazing hockey players.
Yeah, right.
And they're amazing at a lot of things, but I don't think I want to ride that railroad.
No. Yeah. Or at least, that's a really good point, Danielle. I think that we go back and forth where education should always be important, but it's also what you're getting educated in.
I think one of the things that I don't hear, I mean, I'm hearing it more now, but I didn't hear it a whole lot a few years ago, is like how much attention we were paying to the mental well-being and the social and emotional well-being of our kids.
Yeah.
And like there were a lot of things that were missed during the pandemic, right? And there was a lot, like if you had a emotional or mental health challenge or issue before the pandemic, it became significantly exacerbated during the pandemic, because being with your peers and sharing social experiences and trying to understand who you are in relationship to your peers and your colleagues and how to sort of relate to adults, which is what you learn when you're going into school, right? That was a lot of that was lost and eroded. So like we're putting these young people into the world now who don't know how to have a conversation with and somebody who's older who doesn't know how to have a supervisory conversation, right? Those kinds of things. They don't know how to ask for information or how to say, I don't know how to do this. I'm challenged by this. Can you support me? And can you help me? And then if they had mental health issues, they are really struggling now.
Yeah.
I know 2 out of 3 of my kids during the pandemic I offered online therapy, and they, just to put it into perspective, in 2018, our family went through a divorce. So when the pandemic hit, I was just like, this is a lot for my kids to take in. So I just offered, I was like, there's counseling, there's therapy. And 2 out of the 3 of my kids said, yeah. And I noticed that the reason I brought it up was because a lot of our household issues would be arguing among the kids. Like they were just in each other's face all the time. So, and I just thought, wow, they're arguing a lot. Or they'd isolate, they'd be in their room and only come out to get something to eat or drink. And so we started doing Sunday check-ins. Like every Sunday I'd made a dinner and we sit down and we'd say, what's your best and worst, of the week? Like just this is really good thing that happened to me, or this is the worst thing that happened to me. And we talk about it and how do we deal with it as a family? And it's, that was one of the perks that came to our family with the pandemic, was just the closeness and the communication efforts that had to be made. But giving them the opportunity to talk to a professional who's not a family member about the feelings and the changes that were happening within not just their society, but in their own personal life. Because my mother at the time was dealing with metastatic breast cancer. So she was, a high risk relative. And, on top of that, I have 2 grandmothers who were in their 90s that, if they were to catch us, we didn't know, what that would have, how that would affect them. So all of our family ties and connections, revolved around, who's sick, who has symptoms, can we really get together for so-and-so's birthday? And, it was all these things that were norms for my kids where we were like, screeching halt, we have to consider. And I guess, one of the positive aspects of looking at it is my kids became aware of their social responsibilities to mask up, to get vaccinated, and to show that they care about their elders or the high risk people in our communities. Because my youngest son, he actually like kind of had like a social fear or social anxiety about going to places where there were a lot of people. Like he would even say, "There's too many people here, Mom. We shouldn't be here." And I'd say, "Well, we're masked, we're vaccinated, we're vaccinated, we're okay." And he's like, "Yeah, but we're gonna see my or he'd say Konika, but he'd say, "We're gonna see Konika tomorrow. We shouldn't be here." And I just thought, for my kid to be fearful of social interaction or germs or, and the impact that it has on our loved ones is just, it was comforting, but at the same time, so, I don't know how else, I don't know the word for it. Heartbreaking.
Yeah. It's hard, I think, just being at that age, especially in late high school. And I was in college. I had 2 years online of college to finish up and then graduated during the pandemic. And I think becoming a young adult and emerging into the world and into your communities is a really, really hard thing. And just being isolated from virtual school and classes and not being around your friends. I lost my job too, Danielle, which was a really big thing for me in college, looking forward to doing that once I graduated. And that was just no longer an option because of COVID and sports and like you were talking about with your kids. And I think just the isolation and has affected so many people's mental health, specifically Gen Z and the generations below Gen Z. And I know I heard something to a statistic that Gen Z were the people that were the most afraid of germs now. And the researchers they couldn't, for some reason, find out why that was. And it's like, well, we just all survived a pandemic.
Yeah.
And we were washing our groceries before putting them in our fridge. Like this was a huge change in a lot of people's lives, especially younger people who have never experienced something on this level before. And I think the fear about how we were going to come out of it and what the world was going to look like after that, like lost a lot of people, a lot of people probably lost hope, which also has a big issue on mental health and how you heal yourself from those traumas. So yeah, I encourage everyone, everyone to seek those healing aspects for their mental health, specifically our younger generations.
And I think, I love that my brain is automatically like, yes, there were some really crappy things that came, impacted us through this pandemic. But when you mentioned, healing and mental health, I can't help but be reminded that how many of us within our community, we started going out and getting cedar and making cedar tea in this pandemic and going back to our traditions and the medicines that are available to us. I know my kids and I have property and we went up there and we started our first sugar bush, and it was great to be outside in the woods and have my kids be chopping wood and, just hanging out outside, because one, the cabin was a place to be isolated and safe, but it had, things for us to do traditionally and medicine, like all around us, just hiking and getting that physical activity, the fresh air. And I don't know, I think the Native community in general was doing a lot of digging deep and reconnecting to the earth and the medicines that we have within our traditional knowledge. So
what a great point. And especially prior to vaccines. I know I was making a lot of flat cedar tea.
Yeah. I think in the early pandemic on NAC, where I worked, Native American Community Clinic, when the vaccines came out, right, we had people come, our elders come and pray over those vaccines before we delivered them to our family. There's a lot of mistrust in the vaccines, right? That people were like, well, I mean, just like all kinds of crazy talk. Like
Mhm.
I was like, putting tracking devices inside the. I was like, how is that going to work actually, functionally?
Yeah.
I thought, like, if I could be the person that discovered that, I'd be a millionaire, a billionaire.
Yeah. 100.
But I think the other thing was that was really beautiful. I saw it at NAC at our tribal communities all over the world. We were doing really amazing things in our communities, our local communities, to protect our people. If we didn't have access to things, right, didn't have access to, like, the medicines that would treat COVID and those kinds of things, we were doing our best to make people strong, resilient, bringing back traditional medicines, making sure we could help them with their breathing, with their lungs, all kinds of different ways we were trying to make people help support families using our traditional knowledge and medicines. And that was, I think, a really beautiful thing to see. And then when we actually got the vaccine, we did the best jobs of vaccinating our people. And then we supported the communities around us, right? One of the things I love about that is that it demonstrates the, as Indigenous people, you can treat us really horribly for years and we're still going to take really good care of you because we know that you're a relative.
Yeah. Our nation, Danielle and Black River, in the first couple rounds of vaccines, when we had left over, we started vaccinating the non-native community surrounding us. And it's kind of amplifying what Dr. Stately's saying, is taking care of not only ours, but our relatives and surrounding relatives, I guess.
It's a function of our Indigenous values, I think, about, the idea and the principle that we understand that we're all related, right? And the pandemic taught us that we're all related. My well-being is directly connected to your well-being. If you're sick, I could get sick, those kinds of things. And I think it also taught us to, like, the principle of forgiveness. Yeah. Like, you can, treat us poorly, but we're still going to take good care of you.
And that gift certificate helped too.
Yeah, for sure. That $10 gift card you got.
Yeah.
Target
Boutique. Oh, what?
Exactly.
I don't know, and that's the thing is you laugh and we're laughing about the gift certificates, but I can't tell you if I saw like a hand sanitizer, it was in my pocket, like, because they were giving them out free everywhere you went, and so I was like, I can't tell you how many like hand sanitizers I would put in my kids' backpacks and
and the wipes.
keep in my car and everywhere. So
don't forget the wipes. I'm still using those.
That's what your basement is filled with, I think.
That's in the corner there next to the TP, the case of TP, because we ran out of stuff during COVID.
Well, it's funny because, like, as we're talking and we're joking, we're laughing. I think this is actually a function of our resilience, right? So the fact that we can look back on hard times, difficult times, and maybe some of us are still even right now dealing with challenging times. I know that, I don't know if you feel this way, but like, I mean, it emerges in some of your conversation, Danielle, but I feel like the relationship I had with my sons is so different now than it was before the pandemic. I felt like, I'm sure they probably feel like I was a little bit of a warden, or, like I was like the enforcer.
Gatekeeper.
Yeah. During those 4 years where it wasn't really allowing them to do a whole lot of things. And now they're young men and I'm trying to develop a different relationship with them, and trying to be a little bit more, trying to find that softer side of myself still, hold them responsible and hold them, but also try to be a little bit more, gentle with them and loving. And, I don't like that I became an enforcer over the last 4 years. I don't like that part of myself.
But that was for safety and protection and not of love. And
yeah, for true. That's true. I don't know that they necessarily see that way, but
That's good.
we'll get there eventually, right?
Yeah.
So,
well, I'm curious, Danielle, how are your kids doing now? Because I see them in community, and I see 3 great adults or about to be adults, and showing up, and that's half the battle. How are they? What's the residual, I guess, of going through all this as young people?
As far as my daughter, she's now 21 and graduated, masked up, and they had a virtual option or an in-person option. We opted, to do the in-person graduation, but it was still kind of sad knowing that there were students online who attend or chose to attend virtually just for safety reasons. And then she, in the pandemic and isolation era, she really blew up and blossomed in her beadwork. Like we would
Yeah.
sit home and she would just start doing beading and crafting, and that has been a passion of hers that she has grown into due to the pandemic, of like forcing us to stay home and find something to do. And so
Yeah.
she turned to beading, and it's been great. She was one of the first classes or of graduates who did not need to take the ACT
Weird.
in order to apply to college.
Ah,
However,
Wow.
because she did not take the ACT, she just lost the fervor to even continue academia or her secondary studies or higher ed studies.
mhm.
However, now that she's 21, she is now finally thinking of getting back into school and looking at places to apply. And I'm like, yes, but at the same time,
Mhm.
I knew it was the pandemic, because the whole high school career, she was like, when I'm in college or I want to go here, and she would do college visits and, summer stays at some of these, colleges that would offer, summer Indian visits, basically, for American Indian students. And so I was hopeful that she was just going to go on to college, but she works for the nation, continues her passion of beadwork, and is now, considering college, where I'm grateful for all of that. And then my boys, they've basically, stopped doing the sports, but they are now increasing their activities. And so back in the gym, and instead of organized sports, but they're going to the gym with me and keeping me feeling old.
Awesome.
Good cardio, but I'm feeling old. My body is not up to it, but otherwise still healthy. Good kids.
Good.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Well, we got to wrap this up here, and I'm gonna hit the bumper music. And hey, Danielle, Big Peeny Gigi, for coming on. Dr. Stately, I wanted to say thank you for all you've done on these symposiums we've had, and really the great work that you do. And Danielle, you have 3 great kids that show how great of a parent you are, and we appreciate you being on. And Haley, thanks for producing this symposium.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, 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 yeah.